Thank you everyone for joining this episode of the NIOSH Total Worker Health webinar series, How to Keep Temporary Workers Safe at Work. So our featured presenters today, we have with us Dr. Lauren Menger-Ogle. She's a contractor with the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. As a social scientist, Dr. Menger-Ogle's research focuses on understanding and promoting occupational safety and health among workers who experience a disproportionate burden of work-related injuries and illnesses, particularly young and contingent workers. Michael Foley is an occupational safety and health economist with the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries. Michael Foley's research examines how alternative work can affect injury risk in the workplace. And finally, we have Brittany Sakata. She serves as General Counsel for the American Staffing Association. She is a former labor and employment attorney who advises ASA members on a broad range of legal matters, including EEO and wage and hour laws, and more. So, without further ado, I wanted to quickly define total worker health for anyone who is new to this topic. We define it as policies, programs, and practices that integrate protection from work-related safety and health hazards with the promotion of injury and illness prevention efforts to advance worker well-being. So with that, I will pass it over to Brittany for our first presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here with you all today. I've had the pleasure of working with Mike and Lauren over the past few years on a number of projects involving temporary worker safety. And it's just really great to have the opportunity to present to this audience on this really important topic, and one that's really near and dear to my heart. As Sarah mentioned, I serve as General Counsel here at ASA. We have a legal department, 5 members, and I have the pleasure of channeling and chairing all of our employee safety efforts and resources, and I'll get into some of those today. I'm always happy to serve as a resource to outside people, members, non-members. I always feel like employee safety really doesn't know ASA dues. It's important, and I'm here to be a resource. So if you're ever interested in talking a little bit more about this topic, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm really happy to be a resource. And so with that brief introduction, I want to talk a little bit about the staffing industry. ASA is the voice of the U.S. staffing, recruiting, and workforce solutions industry. ASA and our state affiliates, which include chapters and councils, advance the interest of the industry across all sectors, and that's through advocacy, research, education, and really the promotion of high standards of legal, ethical, and professional practices. And so the staffing industry is small but mighty. Nearly 3 million temporary and contract employees work for American staffing companies during an average week here in the U.S. And over a typical year, American companies will hire 16 million temporary and contract employees. And that's not a small chunk of the working population, but it's a small, as I said, but mighty number. But 25,000 staffing and recruiting companies are out there altogether, which operate over 49,000 offices across all U.S. states. So as I said, it's an important industry, and we'll get to some of the reasons as to why. First, I want to give you a sense of where do these workers land? Where do they work? And you'll see here on our chart, it's a pretty good pie where the biggest percentage of our temporary workers are placed in industrial settings, light industrial settings, warehouses, etc. Next, followed by 24% in the office, clerical, and administrative section, industry sector rather. Followed by professional and managerial at 21%. Engineering, IT, life sciences, that's 11% of the industry. And then the sort of fastest growing section, but smallest right now, is the healthcare space at 8%. And I would note, as you see in the bottom left, that 40% of staffing employees work in higher skilled occupations, which might address one of the myths that we'll talk about in a minute. And as we look at this chart, you'll see that the industry has gone through expansions and contractions, much like every industry in the US. On the very end there in orange or red, depending on your monitor color, 2022, the industry is slowly coming back from the pandemic. As you can imagine, the pandemic had an enormous impact on the temporary staffing space, whether, excuse me, whether a pandemic or a recession. Traditionally, temporary staffing is a leading indicator on what's going on in the US economy, which means, not surprisingly, as companies try to figure out what's going on with the economy as it's turning down, they will let temporary workers go or not hire as many temporary workers. And then as the economy starts to turn around, they look to temporary workers to fill into their staff to sort of test those economic waters. And this graph, I think, is a really good indication of that. Whereas you see 2019, it was quite strong at 16 million. 2020, big drop down to 13.6, but it's slowly climbing back out and sits currently at 14.6 million. Like I said earlier, small but mighty. So temporary help actually only accounts for 1.98% of total non-farm employment in the US. At the highest, it's sat right around 2%, maybe 2.01, I think we saw a few years ago. Right now, 1.98. So not a huge portion of the industry. We hear stories that it's growing. Obviously, our members hope that that's true, but it's remained pretty steady at that just around 2% mark for a number of years now. And I'd like to talk about some of the misconceptions of the staffing industry. Because it's a small piece of the US economy, there's a lot of misconceptions that go into it. And we here at ASA really try to educate the press, legislators, companies that might be using our member services about the value of it and what it is and what it isn't. And so on this chart are some of the ones that I hear a lot, which is that clients only hire temporary workers to do really part-time, maybe menial, dead-end jobs that no one else can fill. That temporary work is really just like Uber and Lyft. It's like gig work. There's no protections. It's just like your Uber driver. That's another misconception I hear a lot, and I spend a lot of time educating legislators around the nuances and differences. That temporary workers are stuck in temporary jobs for a very long time. The word permatemp gets thrown around a lot. This idea that workers are hired as temporary and never ever leave the company, but they're still just a temporary worker. They're not part of the end client using clients workforce. And that staffing firms have no skin in the game when it comes to their temporary workers. They just simply place the workers and then they forget about them. That's a misconception I hear, and I find super unfortunate. And lastly, and we'll talk about why all of these are wholly inaccurate, but that temporary workers are not protected by US laws, which couldn't be further from the truth. So to address some of these, I wanted to jump in. First, this is, I think, a helpful graph that shows there on the left two gray bars, the typical average population that works full-time and part-time sits at about 74% full-time, 26% part-time. And then in the second bar, in the staffing employees overall, very much mirrors the US working population in terms of percentage of workers that are part-time versus full-time. Healthcare is a bit of a dip. It's the only one that sits closer to 50%, which isn't surprising when you think about a lot of the roles that healthcare employees fill. But industrial sits at 80%, so it's actually the number of workers that work full-time are greater than the typical US population. So that's I think an interesting and surprising fact sometimes when I'm talking to people about the industry. And next, the vast majority of people in our research, and ASA has a really robust research department that is constantly uh, collecting data, sending out surveys, mining data from the BLS to get information on the industry. It really shows that most workers are very happy with their staffing firm, and you'll see that on the graph on the left side, and that the key driver for 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 seeking temporary work is that they're looking to ultimately get a permanent job. And when we think about why the staffing industry is important, we have to think about it, of course, from two sides. Why is it important to businesses and the economy? And why is it important to workers? And workers who work for staffing companies report that they receive personal support as they're looking for jobs, essentially a headhunter that's available to them to help work on their resume, craft their resume in a way that really helps them find that permanent job, or at least a temporary job that perhaps could lead to a permanent job, and that they spend less time searching. If anyone's done a job search recently, you'll know there's a lot of job boards out there. There's a lot of ways to try to find that perfect job. Working with a staffing firm really minimizes the amount of time that's required to do that. And there's so many people that take advantage of it. It could be the mom that's returning back to the workforce now that her children are in elementary school and they're looking for hours that work around the children's schedule. It could be a retiree that's decided to go back. Maybe they're bored in retirement. Maybe they're just looking for something to do to maybe bridge a financial burden. A number of our staffing firm members really focus on disadvantaged populations and serve as advocates. So we have some that really have a huge DEIB program where they're looking to be advocates for perhaps those that are people with disabilities or justice-involved individuals. They serve as advocates to find opportunities for people coming out of prison and looking for a second chance hire. So a lot of unique pieces to the relationship and benefits that come both from on behalf of employees and employers. And then this is what clients get. That's the third piece of the puzzle. How do clients benefit from working with staffing firms? The biggest, of course, is that flexibility, right? So they might have a huge order that just came in, or it might be a stadium and they need to hire, they just booked Taylor Swift and they need to get 150 ticket takers. There's no shortage of examples of certainly hospitals during COVID, if you can imagine, needing workers quickly, and don't have time to stop and review resumes and interview and check credentials and run background checks and do all the things that staffing companies do quickly and so well with their pool of applicants. So obviously the most important biggest draw for clients and working with staffing companies is that flexibility and speed. The other thing is the ability to gauge workers before they onboard them permanently. So is this person that we're working with for the next month, are they a good fit? Do we feel like they have the skill set that they say they do? Do we feel like they work really well with that particular department that tends to have a hard time finding someone to work with? And then, of course, access to more candidates. I mean, staffing companies are in the business of finding work and workers to put in their pool of applicants. Again, that ability to fill positions quickly, flexibility to change the size of their workforce based on those projects, and then access to people with special talents. So our staffing companies employ CEOs, scientists. There's no shortage of examples of people with very special skill sets that a company could turn to a staffing company to fill a role for. And as we think about what ASA does, I've grabbed this screenshot from our policy agenda page. And we at the ASA Legal Department handle a number of really important topics, but top both in terms of where it is on our website here on the left circled in yellow, and in terms of importance in my mind is workplace safety. And that's because temporary staffing companies, they employ the worker that gets placed at the client site. They are the W-2 employer for purposes of workers' comp costs, and they have an obligation to ensure that they're placing workers at safe work sites, and they have skin in the game. And the reason why they have skin in the game, and you'll see it there on the right side, second paragraph down, is that staffing agencies are subject to all the same labor and employment laws that protect workers. EEO laws, workplace safety, wage and hour, UI, workers' comp, all the things that apply to a standard traditional employer apply to staffing companies as it relates to their temporary workers. And so ASA's role is really to promote compliance with those laws and to create education around them so that our members can comply. And there's a number of agencies out there that have issued guidance, federal agencies that have issued guidance around the importance of treating temporary workers the same as a client's internal workers, and reminding them that the laws exist and still apply, even though it's a temporary worker out at their job site. And here's two great examples. The EEOC has two enforcement guidance documents. These are not new. These date back to the early and mid 90s. And they're all written with the idea of clients, host employers needing to comply with all of the same obligations under EEO laws. ADA, there's one specific to the ADA, but there's also under the EEO, there's Age Discrimination and Employment Act, there's the Equal Pay Act. So these are laws that exist and absolutely apply to temporary workers. And so the agencies have drafted guidance for end user clients on how to comply and utilize these workers in a way that's lawful. Similarly, and Lauren will delve into this a lot more, OSHA has a huge initiative around legal protections for temporary workers. They've launched the Temporary Worker Initiative, TWI, and they've said in as many ways as they can throughout regulations and on their website and through various resources that you can access for free, both on OSHA's website and ASA's, that host employers and staffing companies are jointly responsible. And I put that in red because that's really key for protecting safety and health of temporary workers. And there's a variety of ways that can be done. And for the most part, you can't contract away your required need to ensure that temporary workers are safe at the job site. And there's a variety of ways those obligations must be met. But that's really, these three bullets are really kind of the high level takeaways, which is that temporary workers must receive the same training as internal workers. That host employers, and this middle bullet is really key, that host employers are responsible for site and task specific safety training. And then staffing companies are responsible for general safety and health awareness. And the reason that is because staffing companies aren't at the job site typically. They don't run the warehouse. They don't run the office that the temporary worker is going to be placed at. And so they really can't be familiar with the site-specific hazards or have the ability to abate them. And so that's why host employers have a different level of training required of them. And then the other sort of big takeaway here is that host employers do have a duty to report temporary worker injuries on their OSHA 300 logs. And that's an issue that we hear about all the time, members calling and saying, you know, my temporary worker had an injury, but the host employer thinks that it's our job to report it on our OSHA 300. It's not really about what you know, whose job is what. It's about what makes sense. And the host employer supervises the means and methods of that temporary worker. And so an injury at the host employer site needs to be recorded on their OSHA 300 logs. And so this is the ASA OSHA formal alliance that we signed with OSHA. It was first, the TWI that I mentioned was first launched in 2013, really around this goal of explaining employer responsibilities to protect temporary workers and highlighting that concept of joint responsibility and really breaking down who's responsible for what in specific facts and circumstances. And that's a screen grab there on the right that talks about protecting temporary workers and the resources available. And the alliance was signed back in 2014. It was renewed in 2016. And then I had the pleasure of attending our ambassador alliance signing back in August of 2022, where we were promoted to that ambassador level status. The alliance being such a key piece to our ability here at ASA to create resources and education for our members in order for them to ensure that they're keeping the temporary workers safe and talking and working with the clients to make sure they're meeting their obligations. ASA's role in this has been to really support and assist with the drafting and revisions of the TWI, promoting those through webinars, working with subject matter experts. One thing I'm really proud, I'm proud of a lot of aspects of my job, but I'm very proud of the relationship we've built with OSHA around promoting these really key resources to our membership and outside. And I have the benefit of serving as the staff liaison to the formal line. So if you have any questions about that and what resources are available, I'd be happy to talk offline. This is just some specifics on the TWI resources. You'll see a list there on the right of a number of them. Each TWI includes guidance, sample scenarios, links to the relevant regulations. We just had worked with OSHA, and OSHA launched last summer a heat-related TWI, which I think is really important, certainly as we're coming up on the warm months again. We are currently working on a warehousing specific TWI. I think that will be huge. And then I've dropped in there 2 websites where you can learn more information about any of these. And I won't delve into this because this is Lauren's slideshow for sure. But I'm really proud to announce that an additional temporary worker safety resource is the new NIOSH NORA Council Contingent Workers Work Group. Protecting host employers best practice, or I'm sorry, protecting temporary workers best practices for host employers. I think that you guys are really going to find this to be a fabulous resource, and I look forward to hearing Lauren talk about it, Lauren and Mike talk about it. But in terms of other resources that are out there, ASA has a number of them. We're always updating more. This screen grab is our Safety Matters website. You'll see the website up top. The vast majority of these materials are not behind our paywall and are available to non-members and members alike. If it is something that is behind the paywall and you'd like to have access to it, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. As I always say, I think temporary worker safety really trumps our dues in a lot of ways because it is so important. But you'll see on here we have obviously links to the OSHA TWI relationship. And then as you dig deeper in that website, we have a number of safety best practices. These are drafted in coordination with ASA's Employee Safety Committee, which is a very dedicated group of individuals that serve as the safety experts of our members. And they really worked hard to come up with a lot of the materials that you'll find here. Best practices, operating instructions for a number of our industries, including industrial, nursing. You'll see those below. If you dig deeper, we have a lot of resources on that site. We also host webinars all the time on temporary worker safety. And again, this is just a quick screen grab to show you what we've hosted in the last few years. We work with OSHA anytime we have a new TWI to get a subject matter expert to get on to talk about the TWI, the regulations, and what members and non-members, those are usually open to our non-members as well. And I think that you will find these to be incredibly helpful. And I'm getting to the end of my time, so I'm going into auctioneer speech, but I just wanted to give a couple of trends and takeaways as you're thinking about the industry. One area that we're really seeing a big, let's say, focus and influx, an area that's in flux as we're all trying to better understand what mental health of our workforce means. And that increased mobility, I mean, I suspect a lot of those on this call really either know someone or maybe themselves have changed jobs in the last 2-3 years. Workplace mobility is moving incredibly rapidly. And so the mental health of our workers is really key in understanding how we can support workplace trends and safety trends. I always tell our members the business case for safety is always there. It is a win-win scenario. It's, you know, on the economic side of it, your workers' comp costs are lower. On the human side of it, you are a staffing company that clients want to work with because you have a strong safety program and you show that your worker safety is important to you and part of your core values. And that staffing firms really do provide millions of Americans with assignments that give them that flexibility to work the way they want and can be bridges to permanent employment. And one point I didn't make on my earlier slides when we talked about the gig economy, the vast majority of temporary workers are what are called W-2 employees. They are on the payroll of the staffing company, and they have access to overtime and those types of things that 1099 gig workers do not. And so this idea that staffing is essentially the Uber of workforce solutions just isn't accurate. And so we have to spend a lot of time educating legislators around that. And finally, that we have a number of safety resources out there. Lauren and Mike are going to jump into the new one from NIOSH. I'm super proud of it. And ASA has a number of resources that really can help employers meet the demands of today's sort of rapidly changing work environment, but also do it safely. So with that very rapid wrap up, we will have time for questions at the end, so please don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A panel. I'm happy to chat offline as well if we don't get to your question or if one rises in the future. And I will turn it over to Lauren.
Okay, thanks so much, Brittany. Thanks for your excellent presentation. I think it was a great setup for what Mike and I are going to talk about. So my name's Lauren Menger-Ogle, and I'm presenting today with Mike Foley. Mike and I are the co-chairs of the NORA Services Sector Council. And I want to thank the Total Worker Health Program for giving us the opportunity to share with you today. We're here to talk about a new resource. This was developed by the NORA Services Sector Council through partnership with NIOSH, the ASA, the American Society of Safety Professionals, or ASSP, as well as the Safety and Health Assessment and Research for Prevention Program within Washington State's Department of Labor and Industries, which is where Mike works. And so the title of the document is Protecting Temporary Workers, Best Practices for Host Employers. We have a QR code on the screen that will bring you to the document homepage. And we're also going to be sending out a link to the document in an email after the webinar. You should get that within the next 24 hours. Okay, let's see if I can advance. Okay. So just a brief overview of what we're going to present about today. So first, we're going to give a background on temporary work and how this document came to be. We're then going to give you a little bit of an overview or introduction to the content of the document. We're going to talk a little bit about our dissemination efforts and then share some feedback with you that we've received on the document. Sorry, there's a little delay with my slides. So work arrangements are really a key issue related to total worker health. And that's because we have really been seeing some research showing that workers who are in non-standard work arrangements are having higher or elevated rates of injuries compared to workers in standard work arrangements. And there's really some unique safety and health issues related to these work arrangements. So a standard work arrangement is one in which there's a secure sort of career path. There's stable and adequate pay and benefits, flexibility, and a regular full-time schedule. And so a non-standard work arrangement is one that deviates in some way from that standard work arrangement. And there's a lot of different types of non-standard work arrangements. So employment through staffing companies is one of them, but also multi-employer sites, contracting firms, and as Brittany talked a little bit about the gig economy as well. So in a standard work arrangement, there's typically one employer, there's very clear safety and health responsibilities, and there's a direct pathway for regulatory oversight and compliance. In a non-standard work arrangement, there's often multiple employers. There's divided safety and health responsibilities between those employers. And this can really lead to, communication breakdowns between employers and then between the employers and the workers as well. There's also a more complicated pathway for regulatory oversight and compliance in these non-standard work arrangements. So temporary agency work is one form of non-standard work arrangement, and we often see the term contingent worker and temporary worker used interchangeably, and this can cause some confusion. So we just wanted to lay out, we define contingent work as workers with a job that they do not expect to last or describe as temporary, and that is the BLS definition, the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition for contingent work. Temporary agency workers, which we refer to as simply temporary workers, are those who work are employed by a staffing company to work on the site of a host employer company, and that includes both shorter and longer term work assignments. So we're seeing evidence of increased risk for temporary workers. So there's been some research looking at workers' compensation data. The graph on the left side of the screen shows some data from a study that was actually conducted by Mike Foley in Washington State. And I know it's very small, but you can see the black bars, those are the bars indicating the claim rates for temporary workers, and the gray bars are the claim rates for non-temporary workers. And you can see that the injury rates are higher for temporary workers across almost all of the risk classification categories that were examined in the study. And there's a number of other similar studies in other states that are finding similar trends in the workers' compensation data. I think it's really important to note that there's really an overall lack of surveillance data for temporary workers. So it's really difficult to characterize the actual true burden of work-related injuries and illnesses for temporary workers. So some of the possible contributing factors for why we're seeing this increased risk of injury for temporary workers is that they may be assigned to more hazardous jobs. They tend to be younger, less experienced, more frequently are new to a job, and they also tend to be more likely to be racial and ethnic minorities, and all of those factors have been found to be risk factors for work-related injuries and illnesses. Also, because of the precarity of their work arrangements, temporary workers might not feel comfortable speaking up about safety and health issues or concerns because they might fear that they're going to lose their job if they speak up, or they might be afraid of some other negative repercussions. Also, as I already alluded to, there may be unclear responsibilities between the staffing company and the host employer as to who's responsible for what when it comes to different aspects of workplace safety and health. Host employers might also be reluctant to invest in safety and health protections for temporary workers, especially temporary workers who are on shorter assignments, because they're not part of their permanent workforce. And so because of all of these factors, temporary workers might have a lack of safety and health training, not receive adequate personal protective equipment, and other safety and health protections. So as Brittany talked a little bit about, in 2013, OSHA launched its temporary worker initiative. And this initiative has put out a number of guidance documents outlining the joint safety and health responsibilities of staffing companies and temporary workers. And, though this guidance has been very, very beneficial and, has been a great starting point, it doesn't really go into depth about best practices for staffing companies and host employers. It keeps things at a little bit of a higher level. And so we identified a need to really have a more in-depth, detailed set of best practices for host employers to follow that really outline step-by-step in detail what they can and should be doing to protect temporary workers. And so that leads us to the document that we're excited to share with you today. And so I'm going to turn things over to Mike, and he's going to walk you through and give you an overview of what's contained in the document.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Again, this here's the image of the cover of the document, Protecting Temporary Workers: Best Practices for Host Employers. It was a document, as we said, it was developed by the Services Sector, NORS Services Sector Council Contingent Workers Work Group. But we had feedback in it from people from government agencies, from representatives from staffing companies, some host employers, and worker organizations. So there's a lot of viewpoints, of diversity of viewpoints on how best to protect and promote the safety and health of temporary workers. And I think just to, oops, I know I'm going to be a little bit slow on advancing slides here. Sorry about that. To begin here, just a little word about the organization of the document and its contents. Throughout this writing of this document, we wanted to make sure that we emphasized that when a host employer is considering hiring a temporary worker, they're entering into a relationship with another organization. And this is not an arm's length transaction like purchasing a piece of equipment. This is a relationship which is going to last for a period of time, and each organization is going to have to learn and share information about the other and work together in order to best protect the temporary workers throughout the length of the time the workers on site. So the document is organized in kind of a soup to nuts temporal arrangement, which is represented by this diagram in moving clockwise around from the top in the three phases of this relationship, starting with evaluating and addressing workplace safety and health in a written contract, and then moving around to training the temporary workers and their supervisors, and then lastly dealing with, if it's needed, dealing with injury and illness reporting, response, and record keeping. By following these best practices and going beyond compliance with OSHA laws and regulations, then host employers can be doing their part to ensure a safer and healthier workplace. Each of the three sections includes a set of best practices, followed by a scenario, and there's an image here of one of the scenarios in this off-white color. And the scenarios provide examples of how the best practices might be implemented in a real-world situation. There are also checklists here related to each of the three main sections of the document, as well as links to the additional resources. So let's go through each section one at a time and give you a bit of an overview of each one of them. Please advance. There we go. So in terms of evaluation of each organization, prior to contracting with the staffing company, and prior to writing and signing a written contract, the host employers and the staffing companies should be evaluating all facets of safety and health of each organization and the jobs the temporary workers are being hired to perform. As part of this process, employers should review, host employers should review all the job tasks, job hazard analyses, and equipment, and go over those with the staffing company in order to identify potential hazards and the necessary protections and training and personal protective equipment that each temporary worker should have. Host employers need to provide the staffing company with any requested safety data and other information that will allow the staffing company to evaluate the safety of the work site. The host employer should also, it would be important to invite a representative from the staffing company to come over and to the work site and walk through it to assess the safety conditions. And the host employer should ensure that the staffing company also has a commitment to safety, including a process in place to evaluate job candidates for necessary qualifications and the experience they must have relevant to the tasks that they are going to be performing. Turning to the, then moving to the contracting part of this phase, the division of responsibilities for safety and health between the staffing company and the host employer should be reviewed and set forth in a written contract in order to encourage proper implementation and accountability for pertinent safety and health protections. The written contract needs to clearly specify pertinent job details, including the approved tasks, necessary worker qualifications or experience required, any required PPE, personal protective equipment, and the training each employer is going to provide. It should cover communication and documentation responsibilities for both employers pertaining to ongoing risk assessment, any changes to job tasks or hazards, and training. It should also cover injury and illness reporting responsibilities, record-keeping responsibilities of both employers, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. It should finally cover other aspects of workplace safety and health, such as which employer is responsible for providing the direct supervision of the temporary workers and responsibilities related to medical surveillance and screening when necessary. Oh yeah, a bit confused about which way to advance this. There we go. Turning to the training part of that relationship, according to OSHA, in most cases, the host employer is responsible for providing the site and task-specific safety and health training, while the staffing company is responsible for providing general safety and health awareness training. Site and task-specific safety and health training should be provided to all temporary workers on new assignments or new jobs or tasks on existing assignments, and this training should be identical or equivalent to the training that's provided to the non-temporary employees at the site doing the same or similar work. I should add, it also should be completed prior to the temporary worker beginning work. The document covers in detail the topics that should be included in the site-specific training for temporary workers, such as all the approved tasks, how to recognize, reduce, and control site and task-specific hazards, what's the required PPE, and who will pay for, supply, and provide the training on it, as well as doing any fit testing. The OSHA laws related to workplace safety and health, emphasizing that temporary workers have the same rights and responsibilities as permanent workers. First aid and emergency procedures, and procedures for reporting safety and health concerns, injuries and illnesses, and close calls, as well as what to expect after reporting. I'm sorry, I've lost my cursor there. There it is. Some other training recommendations would be to have workers complete, after doing the training at the site, have workers complete a knowledge assessment to ensure that they understand key concepts and retrain if necessary. The host employer should review the general safety and health awareness training that was provided by the staffing agency to the workers to determine its adequacies. And finally, and very importantly, they should be training the supervisors. Host employers should be training supervisors of temporary workers on the tasks that the temporary workers are approved to perform, as well as making clear which tasks they are not approved to perform. And what are the procedures for changing job tasks, emphasizing that the host employer should receive written approval of the changed tasks from the staffing company prior to the change. And the temporary workers should receive any additional training and PPE needed before the beginning of the new tasks. Supervisors need to be trained on their responsibility to provide temporary workers with the same supervision that's provided to the non-temporary workers doing the same or similar work, as well as the potential need to provide extra mentoring and supervision to the new temporary workers who may be inexperienced with the assigned tasks and unfamiliar with work site. The joint health, safety and health responsibilities of the staffing company and the host employer, as detailed in the written contract, and how to effectively communicate with temporary workers and make them feel comfortable about speaking up about safety and health incidents and concerns. So again, keep losing my cursor. There it is. And then now turning to the third section of the relationship, moving on to injury and illness reporting, response, and record keeping. With regards to reporting of temporary workers' injuries and illnesses, host employers need to inform the staffing company immediately after an injury or illness occurs and report fatalities and required reportable injuries to OSHA. With regards to responding to temporary worker injuries and illnesses, host employers should conduct a joint incident investigations with the staffing company and affected workers and implement preventive measures, and then ensure that temporary workers and their supervisors are aware of procedures for accessing medical treatment and returning to work following an injury. With regards to record keeping of temporary worker injuries and illnesses, host employers are required to record temporary worker injury and illnesses on their OSHA threaded log. OSHA requires that injury and illness records be kept by the employer who is providing the day-to-day supervision and controlling the means and manner of work, which in most cases is the host employer. Excuse me, I'm still struggling with losing my cursor there every time. And then finally, at the end of the document, we have included checklists which represent the highlights of each of the 3 main sections of this document. They can be printed out and completed electronically as needed. And we also have a slide deck for, I'm sorry, I keep struggling with my cursor. If you could advance the slide for me, Sarah, thank you. As well as slide deck for staffing companies to use to educate their host employers, which includes the material that I've just been covering, as well as more details. Thank you. Lauren, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for providing that overview. Again, that's just sort of a high-level overview of what's included in the document, but we really encourage you to take a look and see more in depth what's included. So just a few more slides that I'll go through quickly. We wanted to just share with you a little bit about our dissemination efforts for this document. We've been implementing a pretty ambitious dissemination plan, and our co-branding partners have also been doing a lot to do dissemination on their end as well. For example, the American Staffing Association put out a joint press release with NIOSH, and the American Society of Safety Professionals put out a podcast. We're also working with ASSP. We're in the very beginning stages of developing an ANSI registered technical report based on the document. So we're really excited about that. We're also working with OSHA to create a modified version of the checklist for the document that will be included in the OSHA NIOSH Small Business Handbook. So a lot of exciting dissemination activities. We've been using unique links in all of our dissemination materials so that we can track the traffic to the document. And so as of mid-March, we had over 5,600 page views for the document homepage, and across the document checklist and slide deck, we had over 3,100 downloads. And then this graph on the right shows some of our more advantageous dissemination activities. It shows the page views for those activities. So you can see the NIOSH update accounted for about 1/5 of the page views. That's our press release is called a NIOSH update. Our partner dissemination activities have really led to a lot of traffic to the document. And then we also want to thank our council members who have also been doing a lot to help promote the document as well. So just recently, the American Staffing Association surveyed their safety committee to ask them about their use of this document and their perceptions regarding the document. We had 39 safety committee members respond to the survey, but they didn't all answer all of the questions. So when asked about satisfaction with the document, overall, the safety committee members were very satisfied. So these are individuals who do safety for staffing firms that are members of the ASA. And then when we asked them why they indicated the level of satisfaction that they indicated, we had a lot of them talk about how they really see this as a useful resource for educating their host employer clients about best practices. And we had a number of respondents say that they've actually integrated this document into their onboarding process for new clients, into their sales packages. So we're really happy to see that they're using the document and that it's hopefully going to lead to some good changes. So that's all we have. We want to thank everyone who contributed to the document, the Contingent Workers Work Group, and everyone who provided feedback and other types of support. And then we also wanted to let you know that we're actually in the process, the next step for our Contingent Workers Work Group is to develop a similar set of best practices for staffing companies. And we're in the process of writing that document now, and we're hoping that that might get published within the next year or two. We're always open to new members, and we welcome any questions or any comments that you might have. Feel free to put those into the Q&A. And then I was going to ask Sarah if you could just quickly pull up the homepage for the document so that I could just show it to everyone really quick. So when you go to the document homepage, this is what you'll see. And you can see there's a link to the document itself, to the checklist, a separate version of the checklist. And then we also have the slide deck that Mike mentioned. And then we have something we're calling a dissemination toolkit that includes a flyer, a draft email, and some social media messages that we really encourage you to use to share this resource with your networks. And so thanks again, everyone, for your attention, and we look forward to questions. So I see one question so far, and it is, with the EEO ruling just stalled on workplace well-being programs being limited to or projected to be limited to those only enrolled in workplace benefits programs and not the entire company, how do you see this barrier being addressed or workarounds to allow temporary staffing employees to participate?
I'm happy to jump in, Lauren, with
okay.
if it's helpful with my thoughts.
Yeah, please.
From the ASA's perspective, it's a great question, and it was unfortunate to see those rules were stalled, because I think it is a super timely issue, as I put under my trend slide. You know, under federal law, mental disabilities have the same legal protections as physical disabilities. And so at ASA, we spend a lot of time educating our members around educating their clients around the obligation to comply with things like the ADA, perhaps, or maybe the FMLA, depending on the facts and circumstances. And then, of course, there's all the state analog protection laws around disabilities, mental health issues, et cetera. You know, there's a lot of public awareness, and I think that our benefit packages are slowly playing catch up. Some of our members certainly do offer the benefits to both internal and temporary workers, but really it's a matter of ensuring that the host employer understands that they have an obligation to address concerns around mental health or requests for leave around mental health, just the way they would for temporary workers, just the way they would with their own internal workers, and to work with a staffing firm to help them understand if a temporary worker is struggling or requesting leave, making sure that there's open door policies, a safe environment, really implementing policies and training. You know, whether someone's maybe trained to recognize signs of some mental health concerns, documenting, and really supporting those requests for accommodations. And so we here at ASA have a number of resources around educating clients of those obligations. And sort of the beauty of staffing is maybe one assignment might not be the right fit for somebody who might need every Friday off to attend a therapy appointment, but there could be another comparable assignment that is only 4 days a week. And so we look for ways to sort of promote the industry while also recognizing that there are needs for flexibility beyond just maybe childcare issues. It could be some need to attend to some mental health concerns. So doesn't exactly answer the question, because like you said, the rules are forestalled, and we don't know if they will be revamped again or not. You know, if they are, whether they'll be subject to legal challenge, just like anything these days. But we sort of view it as a non-issue, at least in terms of there's other protections available to temporary workers. It's just a matter of making sure that your client's on board with encouraging the support of them.
Thanks, Brittany. Mike, was there anything you wanted to add for that one? No. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think overall in the best practices document, we're really trying to encourage host employers to apply the same protections to temporary workers as non-temporary workers. And we don't currently have anything specifically related to workplace well-being programs, which might be something we want to think about in a revision down the road, and certainly can think about in the staffing company document that we're working on. But we do talk about applying the same protections for like illness prevention programs and things of that nature. So I mean, that's our overall stance. And then I'm seeing another question here. Would you recommend the same framework for unpaid people like volunteers or students, professional training, part of a certificate, working in industry for experience, et cetera? I think overall, yes, I think we would recommend the same approach. And I think, you know, even though in those situations there might not be two employers, I think that a lot of the best practices that are in the document still apply to those situations that are mentioned in the question, as well as when companies employ temporary workers directly, which, you know, also happens that they don't necessarily go through a staffing company, but they are hiring these workers temporarily directly. I think that a lot of the practices still would certainly apply in those situations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would encourage the person who asked that great question to also visit their state Department of Labor and Workforce Development websites. They likely have a lot of resources to get you started that you could probably fold in with some of the recommendations from the host employer document.
That's great. Thanks, Brittany. And since you mentioned workforce development, I'll just throw out there that I work with a program at NIOSH, the Safe Skilled Ready Workforce Program, and we're actually working to develop a foundational safety and health training curriculum for the workforce development sector right now. I'm actually going to Washington to start the pilot of that program. And so hopefully we'll have that published on the NIOSH website within the next couple of years. And hopefully that will be a helpful resource. I see another quick question. Where can I get a copy of this PowerPoint? We're addressing this topic next month. I believe if you contact the coordinators of the webinar, you can get a copy of the slides, but also that slide deck that we have on the homepage of the document, that includes pretty much everything from Mike and my presentation, or a bulk of it. So that's available on the document homepage. Okay, I see another question. With so many individuals bringing social media into the workplace and attempting to use during the workday, do you envision any guidance when using TikTok and other platforms when working in an industrial environment with hazards are created? Some temporary workers may be confused with what privacy they have when on assignment. That's an interesting question. Brittany, do you have any?
Yeah, I love this question. I have teenage daughters that are always doing TikTok dances and should not be performed on a warehouse floor. So I think it is really timely, a really timely question. You know, I think that this would fall likely under site specific training. So to the extent the host employer has a policy against being on your phone, watching videos, doing anything that would take away your attention on a warehouse floor, that absolutely should apply to temporary workers. They're exposed to all the same risks and hazards, right, that permanent workers are. And if anything, they're more at risk because they're potentially new to the job site. So Mike, you might have some more insight on that. He agrees.
Oh, sorry, I missed a question. Did you ask me something?
No, I was just saying you might have more insight on that one.
Oh, no, that sounds reasonable.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for attending today. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we'll go ahead and turn it over to Sarah to close.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our speakers today. This was a wonderful presentation, and we very much appreciate your time. I just wanted to make a quick note for all of the attendees to connect with us. We have a website, a Twitter, NIOSH_TWH, and a newsletter where we include news from NIOSH, our partners. And in the next newsletter, we'll probably feature this webinar. So if you want even more, please connect with us in these ways. So I will go ahead and close it here, but just one more big thank you, and you will get an email with more information tomorrow. So thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day.